Lord, we thank you that you are a creative God. And Lord, when you created us in your image, Lord, you also gave us the ability to be creative. And Lord, one of those ways that we express ourselves creatively is in music. And so, Lord, we ask for your wisdom. We also, Lord, will be careful because we recognize that you've given us certain musical gifts or certain musical understanding. Lord, and we'll be careful to give you all the glory and all the praise. So, Lord, we ask that you would help us to learn, help us to understand, and even apply, Lord, the truths that of music theory that you put into place, Lord, and revealed to man. And we thank you for that. Lord, bless our time together. And again, Lord, to you alone be glory. Sola Deo Gloria. In Jesus' name. Everybody said, amen. All right, so we're at the School of Worship, Music Theory 101, because there'll be a 201, there'll be a 301. So we're going to cover some of the basics, really regarding pitch, having to do with intervals and scale. Now, the first thing you need to cover is intervals. Intervals being the space between two pitches. Now, two of the intervals that we'll talk about a lot are half step and the whole step. Half step and whole step. Now, half step on different instruments changes from instrument to instrument. A half step on a bass or a guitar is 1 fret up. That's a half step. So if you're hitting a bar chord and somebody says, move that up a half step, then you would move up 1 fret. A whole step would be 2 frets, whether it's on bass or guitar. So that would be 2 frets. This is a half step, this is 2 frets. Now, on a keyboard, will you bring up that keyboard? On a keyboard, it's the next adjacent key, but you have to be careful because you see how E and F are adjacent? That's still a half step. It's not a whole step. A whole step is just not white key to white key, but it's the next adjacent key. That C, the half step, would be the black key, which is the C sharp or D flat. And then from the next half step up would be the D. Now, if you were going whole step on the piano, it would be from the C to the D to the E to the F sharp would be the whole step there. So you go the 2 adjacent keys for the whole step. Now, of course, you can keep adding these and you can say step and a half, which would be 3 frets or 3 keys, 2 whole steps, so forth and so on. But these intervals are important because they help us to establish patterns. Now, the keyboard, and I'll put it up here as well, the musical scale uses the alphabet, okay? It doesn't go A through Z, though. It goes A through G and stops. But for our purposes, we're going to start with C. C, D, E, F, G, A, and brings us back to C again. So this is the notes that are used in the scale. Now, the first scale we need to understand is called the chromatic scale. And the chromatic scale will show us where these sharps and flats are. In other words, there are certain notes that have sharps and flats between them and certain notes that don't. C and D do, so C sharp. D and E do, so D sharp. E and F do not. F and G do. G and A do. A and B do. B and C do not. Now, let's look at the relationship of these intervals because we can learn some stuff here. Okay, so I said C to C sharp is a half step, C sharp to D is a half step, so it's half, 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 half. Be careful, this is a half, not a whole. And a whole from E would be the F sharp. And of course, once you get to C, you start over again. So this is called the chromatic scale, just moving stepwise, half step through the entire music scale. And then, of course, as you go, say, from the left to the right on a piano, you're going all the way up and you continue, and there's little numbers that will designate the octave that you're in, or if you're on a musical staff, you can tell by where the note's placed on the staff. Now, so that's the chromatic scale. Chromatic scale. Now, scales are really important. And remember, we're dealing with pitch today more than rhythm. So in dealing with pitch, where a pitch falls in your hearing is where it is placed on the scale. And there's a certain understanding that we need to have of this, whether we're going to be reading music or playing by ear or playing by charts or whatever. We need to understand these relationships because they will help us immensely when we go to either figure out songs or play songs, or especially when we go to write songs, because there's certain chord relationships that people have been using for hundreds and hundreds of years that help us develop and know what chords go with each other. So this is the chromatic scale. Now what we want to do is we want to look at what's called a major scale. Not major is more important. There's just a major scale, which is sometimes been defined as just like a happy sounding scale as opposed to the minor scale, which is the sad sounding scale. So here we have a major scale. Now, what are the intervals, half step, whole step, that we use to construct a major scale? Well, the easiest way to do this, to show this, is to use C major. So we're going to take these out. But before we do, let's also look at the keyboard again. We can bring that back up. Again, notice E, F, no black key in between there. And we see B, C, no black key in between there. So there's no sharps or flats in between those two intervals. And that's important to recognize because that helps us establish our C major scale. Now the C major scale is unique in that it has no sharps, no flats. All the notes are natural is what we would say. But in looking at it, now we can see as the C major scale is C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, we can see the intervals that are established through this scale, which will hold consistent with other scales. So in other words, from C to D, the first note of the scale to the second note of the scale, we see is a whole step. The D to the E is another whole step. The E to the F is half step. The F to the G, whole step. G to the A, whole step. A to the B, whole step. B to the C, half step. And that brings us back to tonic, or the root note. So here we have the formula that's established for the C major scale, but also for all major scales. So you find the root note, and it's whole note, or whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. That is the major scale intervals. Now, why do you need to know that? Well, first of all, this gives you the ability to build a scale on any instrument. As long as you recognize what the intervals are, you can start at any place on the scale and you can build that C major scale. Let's say if you're on the guitar, you could start on 1 fret. You know that the second degree or the second note of that scale is up 2 frets. Another 2 frets, you find the third scale degree. More about scale degrees later. And then another half step, and then 1 fret, and another 2 frets, another 2 frets, another 2 frets, and then 1 fret. So that's our major scale intervals. Now, what happens when you start with another note? Well, let's do that. As a matter of fact, so we can kind of see some consistency, let me place these down here between those. Let's start with another major scale, one that's used a whole lot in popular music and worship music, and that's the G major scale. This is the C major scale because you start with C and you apply these intervals. Now we have the G major scale, which starts with the G and will apply the same intervals. Now, if we can bring the keyboard back up, we see that between the G and the A, we have the black key and then back to the A. So we have A, Then we have the whole step between A and B. We have the two keys there, so B. And then we have the half step, B and C. They're adjacent to one another, so the half step up is the C. Then we have C to D, which if we start back to the left here, the C, we have the two keys there, so we've got D. Okay, then we've got D to E, which again is the whole step. Then we've got, we have a whole step up from E. So how do we create that whole step when F is not going to do it? Well, remember, sharps and flats. And whenever you write a flat, it's not a small b. A small b can be confusing because if you do a small b, what happens when you do this? That looks like two b's. A flat is drawn by doing half a heart. In other words, you come up as you come off the stem. And then that becomes not two b's, but B flat. So we'll go back here. Make sure that we have that flat right with the half a heart. It's pretty sorry flat. Do that again. That's better. The sharp, the tic-tac-toe symbol, is a half a step up from a note. Half step up. The flat is half step down. And these are terms that we use with pitch. So again, let's look at the keyboard and we see that let's take G for an example. We see G right there in the middle. We see if you go up a half step, we have G sharp. If you go down, you have G flat. So up half step is a sharp, down half step is a flat. Now understand, sometimes we will use terms, we'll say, well, somebody is singing sharp or somebody is tuned flat. And what we mean by that is if there's a pitch, let's say this is perfect pitch right here, and somebody is singing right here, then they are singing or playing sharp. If they're singing or playing flat, then they are singing below the note. Sharp above the note, flat below the note. So you would want to tune accordingly. Now, again, any instrument, since you know the chromatic scale, by the way, if you're going, well, okay, I see on the keyboard where the F sharp is and where the G sharp is, how do I know where it is on a guitar? Well, remember that chromatic scale, and you can start anywhere. Like the lowest note on the bass guitar or on the guitar is E. The next fret up would be F. The next fret up would be F sharp. So again, using that chromatic scale, you can find any note all the way up the neck on any instrument, as long as you know your starting point. So you would have E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A sharp, B, and so forth and so on. Now notice in some places I use the sharps, and in other places I use the flat. We'll get to what you use when in just a moment. But remember, we've got to get a whole step up from E. So to get a whole step up from E, we have to travel two notes up, and so we travel to the F sharp. And sure enough, when we go half a step up from that F sharp, we end up at G. So now we've made our full circle again. Whole, half, whole, half. Now, I don't want to get too in-depth with key signatures per se. You may have noticed if you're looking at staff music, and what I'm trying to do is give an understanding of music theory for people that will read music and will not read music. And if you read music, you're going to know at the start there's a key signature, and if there's no sharps or flats, you know by that you're in the key of C. If there is one sharp, then you know that you're in the key of G, because no other major scale has just one sharp in it other than the G major. No other scale has no sharps or flats in it other than the C major. And so we have this with the one sharp. Now, let's try one more. And this time we'll try the D. So up a whole step from D is E. Up a whole step from E, where we saw this here, is the F sharp. A A half a step up from the F sharp is the G. Whole step up from the G is the A. Whole step up from the A is the B. Whole step up from the B. Now we run into the same sort of problem in bringing the keyboard back. We can see that the B is adjacent to the C, so that's not going to give us the interval. That's a half step interval, and we need a whole step interval. So to get a whole step interval, we have to take it up another half step or to the C sharp. Then a half a step up from the C sharp is the D. So here we've got how many sharps? We've got 2 sharps in this one. Well, guess what? No other key signature has 2 sharps other than D major. So here we have the C major scale, no sharps, no flats. The G major scale, 1 sharp. The D major scale, which has 2 sharps. And so we can continue that. But what's interesting is we can kind of anticipate where the next major scale will be that has 3 sharps. The reason is there's an interval here that we can identify that is the exact interval here. You see, I'm not just guessing at these signatures. I knew when I started at G that it has 1 sharp. I knew when I started at D it has 2 sharps. So what we have here is an interval again between here. What is that interval? Because if we identify it, then we can tell the rest of the major keys how many sharps they have. And so what we see here is that this interval between a C and a G, we can identify right here. What is it? Well, it's whole step, half step, whole step. If we add those together, that's 3.5 steps. The 3.5 steps is a significant interval because it's called the perfect fifth, or usually referred to as the fifth. So that's 3.5 steps equals the fifth. Now that fifth will play an important role in our chord construction, but we'll try to come back to that, or if we get to the chord construction today. But we have this 3.5 steps. That is the exact interval between C and G. Okay, 3.5 steps. It also, if you look here, is the exact interval between G and D. So this is a perfect fifth, this is a perfect fifth. So what we can do is we can take the fifth and we can identify what the next key is going to be. And the next key will be A, that has 3 sharps. And if we do this one, we'll discover the same thing. Here's the perfect fifth relationship. We go whole step up to B, whole step up to C sharp, whole step up to D, whole step up to E, whole step up to F sharp. 3.5 steps is the fifth. I'm going to erase that now. And a whole step from F sharp is G sharp. Half step from G sharp is A. And now we've got our key signature, or our major key that has 3 sharps. So we can continue on until we get to something being all sharps by doing this circle of fifths. So here we have this. Now, in case you're wondering, you're thinking, well, this is way too much information. Well, it is in a sense, but these things will help you determine how to play chords, how to construct chords. When you hear a song, if you can identify 1 chord in it, then you can use some of this stuff to help you figure out what other chords are used in that song. In other words, when I hear a song by ear, I'll get 1 chord, and immediately, because of this music theory, now I haven't given you this knowledge yet, but as soon as you understand the theory behind it, you know that that guy or that girl is getting ready probably to go to one of 7 chords, and it's not a guess. It's okay, they're in the key of G, they're probably going to play certain chords that go with that. And we'll come back to scale degrees in just a moment. But let's finish up with the key signatures. And we're not going to go through every key signature, but since we've identified this circle of fifths, and you can put it in a circle, but to be honest, it gets, to me, a little confusing when you put it in a circle. We're just going to keep these intervals. In other words, from C to G is no sharps, no flats. This has 1 sharp. When you go to G to D, it has 2 sharps. When you go D to A, it has 3 sharps. And if you move from, again, looking at the keyboard, if you move up from A and you would count up 3.5 steps, 7 half steps, if you will, or 3.5 whole steps. So if you go up from A, you'd go A to A sharp to B, B to C, C to C sharp to D, D to D sharp, and D sharp to E. 7 half steps, you wind up at the E. The E has the 4 sharps. Then you go from E and you'll wind up at the B, counting the same way, which has 5 sharps. Then you wind up at the F sharp, which has 6 sharps. Then you wind up at C sharp, which has 7 sharps. In other words, every note in the scale has the sharp. It begins with C sharp, D sharp, E sharp, F sharp, G sharp, A sharp, B sharp, C sharp. Now, as I say that, you go, well, E sharp, there's not really an E sharp, is there? Because you go straight from E to F. Well, in theory, there is an E sharp because, again, show the keyboard. There is an E sharp, and that E sharp we know more as the note F. But if you're establishing this C sharp scale, then you refer to F as E sharp. Just like you ask yourself, is there really a B sharp? Aren't you, if everything's sharp, then this B would be a B sharp, so isn't it C? Well, it is, but there is what's called an enharmonic spelling. And an enharmonic spelling is just the same note with a different name. In other words, B sharp and C, E sharp and F. But here are some that might be less obvious. Again, looking at the keyboard, is you see on the top row, there's those notes that say C sharp and D flat. Those are the exact same notes. Those are enharmonic spellings. Enharmonic spellings. Again, different names, same note. Well, how do you know if you should use the C sharp or the D flat? Well, it needs to be consistent in whatever scale you're using. In other words, if you're in any one of these keys, then you're using sharps. In other words, you wouldn't get to A and go, okay, A to B, B to C sharp. You wouldn't say A to B, B to D flat, because you just skipped a note. You just skipped a note. You have to, go from A to B, B to C, C to D, and so forth. So you can't go from A to B to D flat. You go from A to B to C sharp. So they have to be consistent, okay? If a flat occurs in any one of these things, they're called an accidental, and you've varied from the major scale, and you've made an accident. That's why they call it accidental. Now, well, where do flats come in when we're talking about major scales? Well, there's a different relationship. Same intervals, but if we establish a different relationship, in other words, I know the key that has 1 flat, so I'm going to kind of use that knowledge to go ahead and start in this one place, which is F. So we use the same ratio, the same intervals, okay, to begin to look at and create the F major scale. So we use F, we use a whole step, we go to G, we use a whole step, we go to A, then we go a half step. Now, again, looking at the keyboard, if you go a half step up from A, what do you get? Well, you get A sharp or B flat. Well, we're already using A, so we don't want to use A sharp because we've already covered that note. So what we're going to do is use B flat. And then a whole step up from B flat is C, whole step up from C is D, whole step up from D is E, and a half step up from E is F. So same intervals. Now look what happened. We created 1 flat. Well, guess what? There is only 1 major key that has a flat in it, and that is the F major key. Well, yes, the F major key has that 1 flat. So let's do another one. We'll start with B flat. And again, I'm choosing this for a reason. A whole step from B flat is C. Whole step up from C is D. Half step up from D. Well, we have the same sort of problem looking at the keyboard again. a half step up from D is D sharp or E flat. Well, we've already got a flat, and we have already established that we need to be consistent with whether we're using sharps or flats. So we can't use the D sharp because we're already using the flat. So we'll use E flat. Whole step up from E flat is F, because remember E to F is half a step, so E flat to F would be a whole step. Whole step up from F is G. Whole step up from G is A. Half step up from A is again B flat. Now, notice this is the same note, so that only counts as one flat. And we've got two flats now, okay? Now, the wonderful thing about this is if you're on guitar, if you're playing guitar or you're playing bass, you don't have to memorize every scale. There are patterns on the scale. In other words, when I go to do a G major scale on the guitar, okay, it's called a movable scale on the guitar. And the reason it's called a movable scale is if I move that 2 frets up, remember, half a step is 1 fret. If I move it 2 steps up or come up a whole step, I'm going to be starting on A. And if I play that exact same pattern, it's now become the A major scale. So now the cool thing is you learn the pattern for one major scale on the guitar or on the bass, and that pattern becomes movable so that you can play it anywhere on the neck and you don't have to relearn the pattern, which is very helpful. Now, let's look at and all this is kind of necessary groundwork to, again, help with composition, working out songs, playing with the, other band members and stuff like that. Now, look at the relationship here. C to F is 2.5 steps. 2.5 steps. Okay, now this is another relationship that's called a fourth, and we'll get into scale degrees and I'll explain that, but it's called a fourth so that we know that 2.5 steps is that interval of a fourth. And it'll be obvious why we call those fourths and fifths in just a few minutes. Now, so 2.5 steps up is the fourth, and notice F is the next key and it has 1 flat in it. If you go to this 2.5 steps up from F, becomes the B flat, then the B flat has the 2 flats. If you go to the E flat, well, guess what happens? E flat has 3 flats. So you keep constructing from there, and you can establish the pattern, if you will, of how many sharps are by the 5th, how many flats are by the 4th. So we'll go E flat. If you go through the E flat, F, G, the next would be A flat, which has 4 flats in it. Okay, then you go, trying to do all this from memory, A flat to the B flat, no, to the C to the D flat is 5 flats. When you go from D to the G flat, 6 flats, and then to the C flat, 7 flats. So that's helpful if you're reading a key signature, and it's also, again, important to understand chord construction. Now, there's one other, before we get into a little bit about chord construction, which I think we can get to today, let's cover one other type of scale. We covered the, I'll leave this just for a moment in case you want to look at it or jot that down. We covered the major scale, which is the happy sounding scale. Now let's talk about the minor scale, which is the sad sounding scale. The minor scale, and this isn't in terms of importance, this is just in terms of construction and how they sound, the difference between the major scale and the minor scale. The minor scale is constructed differently than the major scale. When I say that, I'm referring to these intervals, okay? So let's see how that's constructed. Now, we're only gonna cover one, well, we'll do 2 minor scales, and then you'll be able to construct all the other ones from that knowledge so we can get to the scale degrees. There is a minor scale that has no accidentals, no sharps or flats. Now, I know what that is. It is the A minor scale. Now, I know that in part from the fact, well, I don't want to jump ahead. Let's establish the intervals for this. I just know that because somebody told me that. So we're in the A minor scale. So let's look at those intervals. So we start with A and we go through the alphabet. It's even easier than doing it through the C. A, B, C, D, and hopefully you learned this a long time ago. A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And instead of going to H, we go back to A because this is music and not the alphabet. So now let's look at what these intervals are. This is a whole. This is, we know already, is a half. This is a whole. This is a whole. This is a half. This is a whole. This is a whole. So now we have the intervals for the minor scale. Well, what is it? It's whole, half, whole, half, whole. Okay. Now I want you to notice something, and let's look at what's called scale degrees, because that's really important. Scale degrees is a real easy concept to understand, but it is so foundational to music. We use the word degrees, and it's just a numbering system, and it's a real easy numbering system. C in the C major scale would be 1, D would be 2, E would be 3, F would be 4, G would be 5, A would be 6, B would be 7, and again, C would be 1 again. So these are numbered. These are numbered scale degrees. That's going to be essential for you to understand that concept. It's a very simple concept, but understand C is 1 because we're in the C major scale here. Okay? If we were in the G major scale, then the G becomes 1, the A becomes 2, the B becomes 3, the C becomes 4, the D becomes 5. And again, this is crucial. As you can build this scale, so many things open up. Number one, if you're in the key of C major, as long as you're hitting one of these notes, you're going to be in key. You're going to be in key. If you are doing a solo on the guitar, if you're hitting one of these notes, you're going to be in key. If you're singing, you'll be in key. If you're playing, you'll be in key. If you want to do improvisation or spontaneous stuff, then again, you're going to as long as you're hitting one of these notes, you will be in key, which is important because, like when I go do a guitar solo, I'm not guessing at what notes to play. I know what these notes are, or what note of the key that we're playing in, and I go to play those notes, or if I go to bend into one of those notes. Maybe I bend from a B to a C, or from an A to a B, and I'm no longer guessing. So that's really important when you're working on vocals, when you're working on instruments, to not necessarily be guessing, but you can know not only the notes, the single notes, the melodies of what you're doing, but also the chords of what you're doing, and also through chords, harmonies that you would apply. Now, I want you to notice that according to these scale degrees, A is number 6. When we start at C, the C major scale, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, we come to the A note, okay, the A. And when we look at the minor scale, we notice it has no sharps and no flats as well. It has the same notes as the C major scale. The A minor scale has the same notes as the C major scale. Why is that important? Well, because it's a relative scale. That means from a playing standpoint, from a soloing standpoint, from a vocal standpoint, that if you're in A minor and you play the notes of C major, you're going to be okay. Or you sing the notes of C major, you're going to be okay. Why? Because it's the exact same notes. We can't say that about any other key signatures. We can't say that A minor is a relative scale of G major, because we already know that the G major scale has a sharp in it, has F sharp in it. So these are relative scales. Now, the important thing to remember, again, is that A is number 6. Why is that important? Because the relative minor, which is what we call the scale, remember the relative scale, the relative minor scale will always be the 6th degree of the major scale. Okay? So if we start with the G like we did a while ago, we go G, A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G. Then we can see that the 6th degree is the E minor. Well, you want to guess how many sharps the E minor scale has in it? It has 1 sharp, and that's F sharp. Why? Because it's 2 reasons. Number 1, because the intervals fit it. And number 2, it is the 6th degree of the G major scale, so that we know that this is the relative minor of the G major. So, in other words, we can see certain patterns emerging because music is very mathematical. So if we continued this on and went to the D, and we went D, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D, we can know that that B is the relative minor in the D major scale, so B minor has 2 sharps. So in other words, you can do that simply by finding your major scale, going to that 6th degree. Now, here is a really important thing that begins to emerge. Now we get to now that we understand these things, which if you're, you can see that if you're going to solo, these are really important, or perhaps you're singing in a certain key, you can see how they're really important. But let me show how practical and how really important these things are. And I want to I want to leapfrog just a little bit into chord construction, because I want you to understand how chords are constructed. Because just like these scales are constructed in a certain interval, chord constructions are according to a certain interval. Just like you have a major scale, you also have a major chord. Just like you have a minor scale, you also have a minor chord. Now, understand, often when you're describing a major chord, you don't use the major word. In other words, if I'm saying to another band member on the worship team, if I want them to hit a G major, I'll say, hit a G, play a G. And it's understood that that's major. Okay, it's not inferred that it's minor. If I wanted them to play E minor, I wouldn't say hit a E. I'd say hit a E minor. That's important because whenever the designation of the chord is left off, it's implied or insinuated or whatever that it's a major chord. And you never infer, you never just leave it hanging that it's a minor chord. You always would say A minor or E minor, where the same is not true. You would just say G, C, D, and those would be major chords. So now let's look at the intervals between the chords, or between the notes that construct a chord. First of all, for our simple definition of first 3 chords we're going to look at, there's 3 parts to the chord. There's the first, the third, and the fifth. Uh-oh. First, third, and fifth. Okay. Now, by identifying the intervals, I'm going to give them a little more space so we can see. By identifying the intervals, we identify the chord type. Here's 1, here's 3, and here's 5. In other words, if we're going to build a C major chord, there's certain intervals that we look between the first and the third and the fifth. What are those intervals? Well, neat enough, it's the same intervals that occur in the C major scale. In other words, remember these are numbered. Okay, so the first is C, and then we jump to the third, which is 2 whole steps, which is E. And then we go from the third to the fifth, which is a step and a half, which is G. So in other words, we have 2 and we have a half as the intervals. That is always going to be the way a major chord is constructed. If you're wondering, how to construct a major chord is if you can use the chromatic scale to identify the notes on the neck or the notes on the piano, then you can understand. You get your starting place, you go up 2 whole steps, E and G. So when you play a C major chord on the guitar or on the piano or on any instrument, it's going to have these 3 notes in it. Now perhaps you're sitting there and go, well, yeah, but when I play a C major chord on the guitar, I'm actually playing 5 notes. Well, yes, you are. And what you're playing is a C and an E and a G and a C and an E. So you're duplicating 2 of those notes, but you're using these 3 notes. And so you can repeat them over. Generally, you want that root note in the tonic position, or you want that C major to start with a C major. If it starts with something else, you might see an indicator it has a slash and it has an alternate bass. So in other words, you might have a C with a G in the bass, which will be written like this, with G in the bottom. And what that means is a C major chord that perhaps begins with G, and perhaps it goes G, C, E, G, C, E, which would be one that you would play on guitar. Then that's C with a G major in the bass. So that's how that's constructed. So every time you see a major chord, it will be constructed with these specific intervals. Now, what happens when we start to build other chords out of the C major scale is we wind up with different intervals. So this is the C major chord. Now, hang with me, because this is going to lead to something that is incredible. If you've never seen it, or maybe you've never been taught some of this stuff, you're going to see, I promise you, we're going to get to the musical personal application. Now, so here's the C major chord. Okay, let's say we start with a D and we want to build a D major chord. Well, first of all, let's not decide what kind of chord we're building, because these are fixed intervals in C major. So we're going to take the D and the F and the A and look at those intervals. The relationship with D and F is 1.5 steps. Well, we've got a problem, because if it's a major chord, that's supposed to be 2 whole steps, and it's not. Well, let's look at the relationship between the F and the A. Because remember, if we're using D as the one, the 2 becomes 1, the 4 becomes 3, the 6 becomes the 5th for our chord building purposes. Not that we can really change these scale degrees, but so D, F, A. What's the relationship between F and A? Well, it is 2 whole steps. Well, that doesn't work either. So we know automatically it's not a major chord. Well, what kind of chord is it? Well, it's a minor chord. And so we can see now the interval built for the D minor, or the minor chord in particular. And what is that? Well, it's reversed. Between the 1st and the 3rd and the 5th, we now have 1.5 and 2. Now in the case of the D, we now have D, F, A. So that is the D minor chord, but more importantly, we've now identified the intervals. We've identified the intervals that help us to identify a minor chord. Why is that important? Because we have the majority of all chords used in all songs we've now identified. So we know how to construct a major chord, we know how to construct a minor chord, and this is a lot of information. What you're going to do probably is want to look this over, look over your notes. If you're viewing the video, view it several times to kind of let this sink down, because there's a lot of information. Now we already know how to build a major chord, how to build a minor chord, how many sharps are in a major chord, how many sharps are in a minor chord, how many flats according to what key signature, and all these things. And now on top of that, we're building these major and minor chord constructions. So here's what is really neat, that now we can build, we can look at every chord that's in the C major scale. Because there's certain chords that we can construct out of here, there's certain chords we cannot. In other words, if you really wanted to put a D major in the C major scale, well, you're creating an accidental, and we don't want to do that, especially not yet. And so we're not going to look at that. We're going to see what chords are constructed out of C major. So we already know that we have C major, and another designation for major is a big M. Designation for minor is a little m. So we know that that is, actually that should be even bigger. Most instances as large as the letter. That doesn't look too confusing. So C major, D minor. Okay, let's look at the next chord that we would construct in the C major scale and see if that's a major or a minor chord, looking at the intervals. Okay, let's identify, we skip this letter, and we'll identify the relationship of E and G. Well, that's a step and a half. Let's see, a step and a half. It's not a major chord. It may be a minor chord, but let's identify the next interval. G and B is 2 whole steps. Step and a half between E and G. Between G and B, 2 whole steps. So we've got an E minor chord. Okay, so let's look at the next one. F. F, skipping the letter, F to A is 2 whole steps. Okay, so it's looking like it could be a major chord. But let's identify the other relationship. A to C is a step and a half. So indeed, it's a F major chord. Okay, and so we build the G same way. We look at 2, that might be a major chord. B to D would be, because if we just extended this on out, which we can't do, but if we could on this board, we would see that the D is a step and a half. We know that this is G major. When we go to build the A to C is step and a half. It's looking like a minor chord. And sure enough, C to E is 2 whole steps. So now we build A minor. Let's look at the B to, if we continued out, it would be B to D. We've got a step and a half there between those 2 notes. So it's looking like a minor. And then between D and F, well, now we have a problem. B to D is a step and a half. So it looks like a minor chord. But then D to F is a step and a half. So it looks like a major chord. So is it a major minor chord, or what exactly is this new animal that we found? Well, it's one of the other chords that we're going to cover real quickly because you're simply not going to hear it a lot. And that's called the diminished chord. The diminished chord is, I call it the Bugs Bunny chord sometimes, because when you're watching Bugs Bunny, it goes, wah, 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 wah. That's usually a diminished chord. So the diminished chord is a step and a half by a step and a half. Okay? So now again, we're kind of building the house, if you will. And just like if you show up and, to a house and there's lumber and bricks exposed, but the carpet hasn't been laid and the walls hadn't been painted and that sort of thing, you don't really show up and say, well, wow, what a cool house. So, so far there hasn't been that moment where you go, oh, wow, that's so cool. Now I understand life and everything. But you can look at it, and these are the things that are going to build the house, if you will, because, see, we've just discovered something very neat in here. That is, we know every chord that is in the key of C major. Well, what's the significance of that? Well, let's make sure we've covered this first. The major chord, 2 whole steps between the first and the third, step and a half between the third and the fifth. The minor chord, step and a half between the first and the third, 2 whole steps between the third and the fifth. The diminished chord, step and a half between the first and the third, step and a half between the third and the fifth. Incidentally, every part of chord construction comes back and relates back to these scale degrees. In other words, if I'm going to play let's say a C7, let's say a C major 7. I don't want to get into abstract chord construction. Let's say we're playing a C major 7. Guess what we're going to add? First, third, fifth, and 7th. If I'm playing a C6, I'm going to add the first and third and the fifth as part of the C major chord. I'm going to add, to make the C6, I'm going to add the 6th. The C suspended 4th. The C chord is the first, third, and the fifth. To play the 4th chord, then I'm going to add the 4th. So you can see how important these scale degrees become, because now every chord construction comes back to these degrees. The C4, you add the 4. The C6, you add the 6. The C7th, you add the 7. C2, you add the 2. So once you know this, You don't even have to know how to play the chord. You can construct the chord on keyboard or guitar because you know that you need to add a D note in order to do the C2. And you find out where that D note is on the guitar, on the piano, or the bass, and you can play that interval, that arpeggio, and play that chord then. So I'll explain arpeggio. Arpeggio is just, instead of hitting the block chord, first through fifth, you might go dun, 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 and then you're using, that was not perfect pitch, but you're using those notes to arpeggiate or perform an arpeggio in that you hit these notes not all at once, but in a broken fashion. So here's all the chords that are in the key of C, okay? So why is that cool? Because once you have these established, you can, number one, you don't have to guess at chords anymore. In other words, if we're playing a worship song and it's in C major, I want you to notice these major chords. The majors are 1, 4, and 5. 1, 4, and 5. Now, sometimes in chord movements we use Roman numerals. You remember, if it's to the left, you subtract it. So you subtract the 1 from the 5 and you get 4. And then the V, of course, is the 5, or the 1, 4, 5 movement. The 1, 4, 5 movement is the most common chord movement in all of music. Whether you're dealing with pop music or classical music or country music, or less so with jazz. So the 1, 4, 5 is very common. And if you've been playing it all for very long, you realize C, F, and G. Hey, you know what? I've played a song that has C, F, and G. I've played a couple of songs that have C, F, and G. As a matter of fact, a lot of songs have C, F, and G. Or if we look at it in the terms of the G, and this is going to be the last thing that we cover, because I know this is a lot of information to take in, especially if you're completely unfamiliar with this. Here we have the G major scale. We construct it using the same intervals, and we know we've got an F sharp. We wind up with the G major, which we're just going to leave that plain because after all, we said that major is implied. We have minor, B minor, we have C major. How do we know that? Because every time the first, fourth, and fifth of any scale, major scale, will be the major chord. So we've got G, C, D are the major chords. The E, the sixth, will always be the minor. We also know that to be the relative minor. The seventh will be the diminished. So we have F sharp diminished and back to the G, which is our tonic. Okay, now we can see in G what chords. Now, so if you can identify, if you're trying to play a song by ear, or perhaps you're watching somebody, perhaps you're watching worship on Thursday night or Sunday morning, and you see that, hey, I think Pastor Dave is hitting a G there. I think he's hitting that G. Okay, well, guess what? If you just know that simple fact, you can begin to piece together the rest of the chords that are in that song. G, C, and D will be the major chords. So if I'm listening to a song and I go, okay, it's G, C, D, and I figured that out. And of course, lots of songs. In The Secret, Lord, I Lift Your Name on High, The Old Rugged Cross, Every Move You Make, just on and on, have G, C, D in it. A lot of pop songs, a lot of rock songs have G, C, D in it. So we take that and we can build. So let's say I've figured out that a song has G, C, D, but then it goes to a minor chord. What minor chord is it going to go to? 90% of the time, it's going to go to that minor sixth, because other than the 1, 4, 5 movement, the next most common is the 1, 4, 5 minor sixth. 1, 4, 5 minor sixth. So this would be G, C, D, E minor. In the key of C, it would be C, F, G, A minor. Now again, if you've been playing for very long, you go, oh yeah, you know, I know lots of songs that have G, C, D, and E minor. A lot of those chords, a lot of the songs I just mentioned have G, C, D, E minor. So E minor is used in, the Lord, I Lift Your Name on High. With those 4 chords, you can play so many songs. Every Move You Make, with I think the Old Rugged Cross, in The Secret, they have those 4 chords. So you identify that one chord, or remember that this is all movable. In other words, if we move this to the D, we go D, E minor, F sharp minor, G, A. We have D, G, A, B minor, D, G, A, B minor. There's lots of songs that have those 3 chords in it. Okay, so what this does is it opens up. See, when somebody's sitting there, let's say you're sitting there writing a song, and you know that the song starts with a C, and you got this really cool lyric that, and you're strumming the C chord, and you go, well, gee, what chord do I go to next? Well, if I'm writing a song, I'm not guessing what chord to go to next. I'm not going to go, well, we're in the key of C, why don't I'll play a Z flat minor or something. Well, no, a Z flat minor is not in the key of C major. What I'll do is I'll go from the C and I'll go, well, I know F and G are those other major chords, so I'll begin to construct the chord like that. And then if I get into the bridge of the song and I figure I want something, a sad sound in order to go into the chorus, I'm going to go that A minor. Why? Because this is so essential. This is used, no exaggeration, this is probably used in more than 90% of all songs that have ever been composed are composed using this formula, 1, 4, 5 minor 6. And if you can understand this and if you can grasp that, then the whole musical world has just completely opened up to you. So I know that we've covered a lot of stuff in regards to pitch today. To be honest, everything else from this point builds off of this, even to the 401 music theory, and to building harmonies, and to building all these other types of abstract chords and different intervals. They all are building off of this. So while you've gotten a lot, this is this is the house. And from here on, you're just like painting the walls and those sorts of things. But you can begin to see the relationship and begin to think in terms of the relationship, because music isn't guesswork. Music is mathematical patterns. And once you understand those mathematical patterns, then you can begin to write songs and possibly record songs. You can certainly enjoy your playing more. You can know how to figure out songs. When they talk about people playing by ear, they have people that play by ear, and I can play by ear. I can listen to a song once or twice and pretty much know the chords that are in it. Why? Because I have an understanding of this stuff. I figure out there's a G note and a G chord, and then I just wait because I know that C chord's coming and that D chord's coming, and he goes to a minor, bet you it's E minor. Why? That's the most predominant chord movement, 1, 4, 5, minor 6. So we've covered a lot of stuff, intervals, half steps, whole steps, and talked about the steps, the keys that are next to each other, the 1 fret, 2 frets, how those intervals construct the scales, the major scales, how they construct the minor scale, then how the major scale, the major chord is constructed, the minor chord is constructed, the diminished chord is constructed, and then where they fit into this. So what you can do is go through those other keys and begin to see these same patterns emerge. Or maybe go back and look at some of the songs that you've already learned, or in the midst of learning, or gonna learn, and look for these patterns to begin to emerge. Whether you're talking about Bach or Beethoven or Mozart or Chris Rice or some of the more current songwriters, you're gonna see these patterns emerge. And so what you've got now is the working knowledge to understand the mechanics behind everything that you do musically. I know it's a lot to absorb, especially if you're, if all of this is new, but man, it so begins to open up the world of music, and so makes playing songs easier, figuring out songs easier, composing songs easier, playing with other people in a band easier. It's all built on this. Welcome to Calvary Chapel, the Triad School of Worship, Music Theory 201. Now, one of the things you want to be sure is that you have some understanding of the basics of music theory, and so you want to review that DVD, Music Theory 101. If you haven't already done that, then go ahead and do that, and then you can jump back and watch the 201. But let's open up with prayer. Lord, we thank you for giving us music. And Lord, there are certain guidelines that are set forth in music that you placed in motion. And Lord, we want to recognize those guidelines. And Lord, we do want to use the giftings that you've given us to give back to you. So Lord, we ask that you would be with us today. Lord, that you would give us clear understanding, give me clarity of thought and teaching. And Lord, may we always use our music to glorify you. In Jesus' name. Everybody said amen. All right, so first thing we want to do is a real quick review of something that we went over on the Music Theory 101. Real quick. These are the notes that we're dealing with. We'll start with C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. And we talked about the fact that there's two places that have no sharps and no flats between them. And that is E and F and B and C. A sharp is one step up. And a flat is one step down. Well, let's say half step. Now, these terms are also used, if somebody says somebody is singing sharp, what they mean is they're singing over the note. They're not necessarily singing a half step above the note. If somebody says that somebody is flat, then they mean that they're singing below the note. Or if you're playing guitar and somebody says your G string is flat, then what they mean is that your G string is tuned too low and needs to come up. So these are the two areas, the E and F, the B and the C, that do not have sharps and flats between them. The rest do. And again, I'm moving quickly through this because we covered this last time. Now, so we have that, and remember we also went through the steps of the major scale. We're going to use C for an example. Between the first two is a whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. So these are the increments or the steps of a major scale. And we talked about the fact that as we move these around and have different starting points, like say when we start with G, what we're going to find is that using these intervals, we're going to wind up with one sharp, which is F sharp. And if we continue on, then we start with say D, we're going to wind up with an F sharp and a C sharp. So these intervals are fixed intervals, and they are a real important part of understanding music theory. So these are things that you probably want to commit to memory. So again, we moved over these pretty quickly, and we went into the minor scale and whatnot on 101. But we're going to use this as the basis for what we're getting ready to go into today. And notice that the key of C major has no sharps and no flats. Now that is the only key that has no sharps and no flats. The only major scale, major key that has no sharps and no flats. So we start with this. Now, we're going to use this as a launch to talk about chords. Now, again, you have a major scale, you have a major chord. You have a minor scale, you have minor chords. So let's look at the fixed intervals used to figure out major chords, minor chords. We'll go ahead and add diminished chord. These intervals, again, are fixed. In other words, you can't move these around. As you move to different notes, those notes change, but these intervals are fixed. They're fixed. Now, a major chord we're going to look at scale degrees and how those fit into this. So what we're going to do, we're just simply going to number these. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then 1 again. Now, in the construction of a chord, we have what's called the first, third, and the fifth of the chord. These are used to form any chord, first and third and the fifth. These are the fundamental notes, if you will. Now, if you remember these intervals again, you can see simply by these intervals we can define the chord structure of the C major chord. And that is between the first and the third, there is 2 whole steps. Okay? So first, third, fifth, we have 2 whole steps between the first and the third. And you also see that between the third and the fifth, you have a half and 1, so you've got 1 1/2. So between the third and the fifth, you've got 1 1/2. Now, that'll mean different things to different people depending upon the instrument that you're playing. And on guitar, a half a step is 1 fret. On the piano, it's the immediately adjacent note. And so you would say, this would be moving up 4 frets, this would be moving up 3 frets. And different instruments, so forth and so on. But this is the major chord. So if we look at any other chord in here that we can build out of here, we're gonna notice a pattern that's gonna quickly emerge. Okay? So, and again, this is the root note of the chord. As we move, then that root note changes in the sense of if we start our chord with D in the key of C major, then we're going to use that as kind of our number 1 in building of that chord. Now let's remember, we're in the C major scale. And for the moment, we're not going to vary this. We're just going to stay in this scale and apply everything to here. So if we started with the D and we said, okay, let's form a chord using the D, and for the moment, we're going to use the D as the first. Then what happens is you simply count a little different. This is 1, this is now 2. And this is only for the purpose of building a D chord. This is not, we can't change those scale degrees in the C major scale. F would be 3, G would be 4, A would be, A would be 5. Okay, so now we see that the first, third, and the fifth that we would use to build the D chord is D, F, and A. Those are the 3 main notes in the D chord. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the intervals and determine, is this D chord a major chord? Again, we can't change these notes because we're in the C major scale. These are the notes in the C major scale. So when we look at the D and the F and the A, let's look at the relationship they have with one another and see if this is a D major chord. Now again, we know that the major chord is constructed by having 2 whole steps between the first and the third and a step and a half between the third and the fifth. So let's look at this. Let's look at the relationship between the first and the third. It's a step and a half between the first and the third. We go over here and say, well, no, it's probably not going to be a major chord because this is supposed to be 2 whole steps. Well, let's look at the relationship between the third and the fifth, between the F and the A. Well, we have 2 whole steps here. So again, in the major chord, the relationship between the third and the fifth is 2 whole steps. So what we have is not a D major chord. What kind of chord is it? Well, it's a D minor chord. And so we know that because of these fixed intervals. So the minor chord is constructed exactly flip-flopped from the major chord. The first, the third, and the fifth. And now we have 1 1/2 between the first and the third, and we have 2 wholes between the third and the fifth. Now these are the predominant type chords used in all of music, major and minor chords. And I'm going to mention the construction of the diminished chord for just a moment. You're probably not going to use them a whole lot unless you're doing some sort of orchestral or symphonic thing, or you just like the the music when Bugs Bunny falls, when he goes whack, 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 whack. Those are usually diminished chords. But so let's look at the relationship again. Step and a half, 2 whole steps. So what we can do is determine what chords go in the C major scale simply by going through and applying this same principle. So now what we've already figured out is that we have C major, and if a chord is not labeled, it's assumed that it's major. Sometimes you'll see a large M, but usually it's just not written on most chord charts. We have C major, and we've already figured out that the next one is D minor. And notice I've written that as a small d, which is an indicator that it is a minor chord, and also a small m beside it. So this is the symbol for D minor. Now let's look at the E and see what chord we wind up with there. Again, we're going to renumber for the sake of constructing the E chord. And now E is the first, F the second, G the third, A the fourth, B the fifth. Okay? So let's look at our grid over here and see which kind of chord is it. We see E to G, first to the third, is a step. Here's a half, and here's a step. So it's a step and a half from E to G. So it looks like it's going to be a minor chord, but let's look at the relationship of the third and the fifth just to be sure. The third to the fifth, the G to the B, is 2 whole steps, so we see that it forms a minor chord. So now we've got E minor. So we've got 3 of our chords established in the key of C major, and those chords are C, D minor, and E minor. Let's move on to F. It's getting a little jumbled over there, but hopefully you can see that. F is the 1, G is the 2, A is the 3rd, B is the 4th, C is the 5th. Now again, this is just for chord construction purposes. We're not changing these scale degrees or these numbers given to each note of the scale. So when we start with F as the first, we go to the 3rd, which would be the A, and we see it's 2 whole steps. So again, going back to our grid, what do we see? Well, that it's going to be it looks like it's going to be a major chord. But again, let's check the 3rd to 5th relationship, because both of these have to be in place. If it's 2 whole steps first to the 3rd, and then it's 2 whole steps from the 3rd to the 5th, then we're going to see that it's an augmented chord. But so you just want, I don't want to get an augmented chord, but we just want to make sure that both these relationships are in existence. So when we look at the F, we see F to A, that is 2 whole steps. A to C is a step and a half. So indeed, it is a major chord, and it's a F major chord. So when we write this, we're going to write a big capital F there. Now, this is a little tedious, maybe even mundane, but what comes out of this is an understanding of music theory that helps you not only to play an instrument, but also to be able to figure out by ear how an instrument is played, or what chords are going to. And we'll talk about that in just a minute as we figure out these other chords. But this is stuff that you can say, well, I don't want to know any of this stuff. I just want to play. But you know what? If you know this stuff, it makes it so much easier when you're trying to figure a song out or how to play, or especially in songwriting. Now, if you don't know it and you go to write a song, what's going to happen is you're going to naturally gravitate towards these rules and these settings and these mathematical formulas, but it just gets you there a little bit quicker to know the formula. So if we were to continue out over here, D, and start this again, C, D, E, F, G, we'll just write these out here. If we were to continue, actually we won't need that G. And again, what we're going to start, we're going to build the G chord, so we're going to label the G the 1, A the 2, B the 3, C the 4, and D the 5. And again, what we're doing is just repeating these notes here out to there, just so we don't have to come back and it's a little clearer. All right, so now we've got the G chord, the G, the A, the G the 1, A the 2, B the 3, C the 4, D the 5. And let's look at those relationships of those intervals to see if it's a major or minor chord. Well, G to B, first to the third, we're going to see it's 2 whole steps. So it looks like another major chord. 2 whole steps between the first and the third. Let's look at the relationship between the third and the fifth, or the B to the D. Well, that's going to be a step and a half. As we look at this, we see the B, half a step to the C, whole step to the D. So that's a step and a half. So we've got another major chord. So we're going to write G up there. Okay? So now we've got C, D minor, E minor, F, and G. Now we've got, 2 chords left. All right, we've got the A and the B, so let's build the A. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. A the first, B the second, C the third, D the fourth, E the fifth. And this is, again, just to build the A chord. We're still, notice I'm leaving these other 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1 numbers because we're gonna build on that, and that's not a changing thing. So let's look at the relationship. A to the C, or the first through the third, is a step and a half. So again, using this as our grid, it looks like it is going to be a minor chord, but let's check the third through the fifth to be sure. And the C to the E is 2 whole steps, so it is a minor chord. A to the C, step and a half, C to the E, 2 whole steps, so we wind up with an A minor chord. And I make the little A like the computer does, so hope that doesn't confuse you. Now, we got 1 chord left, and that's the B. So now if we start with B as the 1, C is the 2, D is the 3, E is the 4, F as the 5. Now again, for chord construction purposes only, let's examine the relationship between the B and the D and see what that spatial term is. Between the B and the C is half step, C and the D is a whole step. So it's a step and a half between the first and the third. So it looks like it's going to be a minor chord. But let's look at the relationship D to E, third to the fifth. D to E is a step and a half. Okay, so now we've got a problem because it's not a minor chord, because a minor chord has a step and a half between the first and the third and 2 whole steps between the third and the fifth. So it's not a minor chord, but it's not a major chord either, because the major chord, it does have a step and a half between the third and the fifth, but it has 2 whole steps between the first and the third. So we've got a problem. Well, we have a solution. This is what's called a diminished chord. And this spatial relationship between the first, third, and the fifth is different. It's a step and a half and a step and a half. Now, a diminished chord, you're going to be able to, you'll kind of hear it. I'll go back to the keyboard. Let me play these 3 chords, different type of chords for you, and you can hear how they sound different. A major chord is it's been described as kind of a happy chord. And if I add the bass note, okay, so that's a happy chord. That's C major, okay? Now, the minor chord has been described as a sad chord. So we'll use C major scale and use D minor. Hear the sadness of it all. And then the E minor, again, kind of sad. Then we come to the F major. Again, it's a happy little chord. And then the G major, happy chord. We come back to the A minor, sad chord. All right, and then the diminished. You hear how that just sounds, well, it sounds a little weird, actually. Sounds demented. So you can maybe use that to remember diminished, demented. Yeah, it sounds like somebody's hiding in the hallway. Yeah, exactly, that sort of thing. So now let's go through those chords of the C major scale. C major, D minor, E minor, F major, G major, A minor, B diminished. And notice how the B diminished is just kind of leaving you hanging. You wouldn't want to start a song or end a song with that chord. It actually draws you into the resolve of the C major. So you hear how this creates tension. Oh, it's going to be okay. Okay? So tonic is kind of the C major is your kind of your resting place in this. Okay? Now, I'm going to ask the people here not to say anything out loud, but I'll play a chord and then you guess at what kind of chord, if it's major, minor, or diminished. Guess which chord that is. If it's major, minor, or diminished. It's major. Okay, how about this one? Major, minor, or diminished? It's minor. Okay? Major, minor, or diminished? That's minor. Major, minor, or diminished? That's major. Major, minor, or diminished? It's diminished. So you see how once you begin to understand these relationships, now you can hear a song and you can go, oh, that's a major chord or it's a minor chord. And you can actually begin to play by ear by knowing that. And what's really cool is once you apply these things, your knowledge of the chord to the scale degrees, life gets a whole lot easier. See, when I go to figure out a song, let's say I've never heard the song before, it generally would take me one time of hearing the song where I will have all the chords in the song figured out. Now, if you just watch that, you go, oh, wow, it's a really great ear. Well, not necessarily. It's a trained ear, okay? And as I hear the chords, I go, oh, that's a minor chord, or that's a major chord, or that's a diminished chord. And I'm using my ear through the network of this pattern that's emerging now. Just like if you were in a place where they're speaking a foreign language, you can guess at what they're saying, or you can have some sort of basis for knowing what they're saying. So now, we have these chords established, if you will. So now we're going to take all this stuff away. Not everything, but we'll clean it up a little bit. And we said B diminished. We're going to use a small b, and we'll use D-I-M, period. It's probably the easiest way to remember that. We're going to wipe these out so we don't get confused by those. So now we have all the chords that are contained in the C major scale. Now, here's how this helps. Let's say I'm watching somebody on television, and they're playing a song, and I notice they start with a C chord. Well, probably 95% of the time, people are going to start and end the song on the chord that it's in the key of. So if they start the song in the key with a C chord, then you can pretty much figure out that they're going to be in the key of C, and they're going to use those chords that are in the key of C. Now, what just happened? Well, instead of looking through all the different chords that they could use, you have a pretty educated guess on what chords they might use, and that's these 7 chords. Okay, now what we're going to do now is we're going to use Roman numerals to show these chords, and we're going to keep with our capital system in the sense of big Roman numeral I, or 1 for C. We're going to use 2 small i's for D minor. It's the second of the scale degrees, and we use 2 because it's the second scale degree, but we use the small one because it's the minor chord. So we would use the small one for the E as well. Then we would use a large Roman numeral. I'll remind you that that's 4 right here. That's the V is the 5. You put it to the left, that means subtract it. And so this is the 5. And it's large again. Why? Because the G is major. So these 3 are large because they're major chords. The rest will be small because they're minor and diminished chords. So this will be 6th, this will be 7th, and sometimes what you'll see is you'll see a little degree marker to the side of the diminished chord. We're not going to do that because it can get a little confusing. And then, of course, C, we're back to the 1 again. So here's the thing. There's certain chord movements that are very common in music. And here's another thing. When somebody does a solo, let's say I'm playing with a band, I'm playing guitar, and we're in the key of C, I don't look at the whole neck going, gee, what note should I play? I know immediately that since we're in the key of C, I will play these notes. And I'll play these notes exclusively. I won't play any other notes. Now, I may bend from an F to a G, or I may bend, from a E minor, from an E to a F or something. But these are the notes. So as I go through, when I do that, then I'm utilizing this knowledge of the scale. Also, I'm utilizing the knowledge of the chords. In other words, the first and the fourth and the fifth, these three major chords, are that movement. 1, 4, 5 is the most common movement in all of music. It's by far the most common in rock and roll. It's by far the most common in classical. Jazz, less so. Country, by far. So almost every type of music. Chances are you've heard this in some songs. So we've got that C and the F and the G. So, you can do so many things with this. So that's the CFG. That's the 1, 4, 5. Now another very common movement, if you add another chord, would be the minor sixth. And in this case, that's the A minor. Now, I can't tell you thousands of songs have been constructed with the C, A minor, the F, and the G. From, the 50s. And I'm just playing a C major, A minor, F major, G major. Then you can add that whole thing. So, or today, So again, that's C, A minor, F, G. Another variance, I guess, would be to have it going through the C and F, G, and then into the bridge, you go into the A minor, to the G, and to the F. So what happens now is once I establish that the song is in the key of C, or maybe I want to write a song in the key of C, I know immediately that the most common chords I'm going to be using are probably that C major, the F major, that G major, and the A minor. So those are the three most common chords, and probably in order of usage then would probably be the minor second, followed by the minor third, followed by the diminished, which you're just not going to hear a lot of unless it's classical music or a thriller movie or something. So in terms of likelihood to occur, I would say first, the obvious chord you got to use if you're in the key is the C, then the G would be the second, the F would be the third, the fourth. So first, fourth, fifth, you're going to find that in almost every praise song, every worship song, as far as this movement. Now we're going to apply that movement to other keys in just a second, but I'm more interested in you getting the concept than getting every applicable way you could use it. And then the fourth most common chord would be that minor. Fifth would be the D minor. Sixth would be the minor third or the E minor. The seventh would be that diminished chord. So here's what happens. I'm listening to a song in C. Here it goes to another chord. It's a happy chord. Well, I know that's either an F or a G. And after a time, you'll actually know. You won't even be guessing. You'll say, well, that's an F or that's a G. So those are the first three most common chords. And then most, I don't know what percentage, but most songs will include that minor sixth. And with those four chords, you can play thousands of worship songs. You can figure out thousands of songs. You could write thousands of songs. And then again, if you hear another minor chord after that, then it'll probably be the minor second or the minor third, and then diminished. You're just not usually going to hear that very much. Now, let's apply what we've learned here to a couple of other keys so that you can see. You know what? I'm just going to redo this whole thing. It's almost coffee time. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, and B diminished. Incidentally, that was a mistake, but you want to figure out the rules, and then you'll figure out how to break them later. But here is the chords in the key of C major. So we'll change this to C major chords. Now, what's interesting is because we're dealing with mathematics, where we move these spatial concepts stay the same. In other words, if we move this to the key of G, okay, then the G will be major. The second degree of the G major scale or the major key will be A, and it will be A minor, okay? And so the third, because again, these spaces stay consistent. These spaces stay consistent in constructing a major scale, and these spaces stay consistent in building chords that we've now come up with a system that we can approach any key. So G would be A minor, would be B minor, would be C major, D major, E minor, and F sharp diminished. Now we spoke in Music Theory 101 of why that would be an F sharp, and it's because this spatial relationship is a whole step, and so E to F is a half step, E to F sharp is a whole step. If that's confusing, you may want to go back and review that first disc, and then of course you wind up back at C, back at G. Okay, so now the first, fourth, and fifth of the G major is G and C and D. And this is something that you might, this whole numbering system is something that New York, LA, Nashville, they use in chord charts. You might have at the top of the chart G, and then you would just have letters throughout the chord charts. Now, most worship teams actually have the printed chords on the sheets for you to follow, but it's good for you to understand the system. And again, so G, C, D, you're going to see all sorts of songs with that, especially when you throw in that E minor. I can sit here and, Lord, I lift your name on high, G, C, D, E minor. In the Secret, G, C, D, E minor. There's just, again, thousands of songs that will use those three chords. And so you can keep extending this out indefinitely. We'll look at just one more because I do want to cover some other things. And again, this has to be a whole step from D to E, from A to B, E to, remember we looked at this, E to F is a half step, but we need a whole step. So we sharp the F, and it will be F sharp minor in the key of D major. And this will be a G, this will be an A, this will be a B minor. And then we have C sharp diminished because, again, we need a whole step here. From B to C is a half step, so we sharp the C to make the correct interval, and we wind up at D. Again, we have the 1-4-5 of the G, G, A, the 1-4-5 minor 6, D, G, A, B minor. Lots of songs, again, in that. Empty Me, Jesus Draw Me Close, He Knows My Name, just a lot of different. And again, so once you can see, especially if you play guitar, you see somebody start with a C, then you can guess at the rest of the chords, whether you get to hear them or not. G, same thing, D. So again, if you identify the first chord, it's given you a huge lead in identifying the rest of the chords. Not only that, but if you're sitting there writing a song and you start the song, you start it with a D, then you're going to know what chords to use in that song, and this is kind of your menu right there of chords that you would use. So, and this can continue on. If you apply this intervals to building the scale and the intervals to building the chords, then you can
you can figure out any key, any scale, any chord, and any key. So rather than go through all the examples of how this and every key use this principle, and between the two, between the 101 and the 201, you can figure out how to make key signal, figure out how many sharps, how many flats in a given key, and you can start from anywhere. I'm not going to include the circle of fifths. I know a lot of people do. To me, it adds confusion. I never thought that was a really good teaching tool to begin with. Now, let me put these back up because I want to go over one thing, and we might refer back to this. Remember we said the C chord, the C major chord is C, E, G. And we talked about the fact that this is the first, third, and the fifth. First and the third and the fifth. Let's look at this relationship a little bit more. What happens, usually you'll have a C in the lowest note or the bass note of the chord. And if the guitar player is playing a C chord, yes, he's playing more than 3 notes, but it'll be these notes. A C chord is usually C, E, G, C, E. But there's other voicings that you can play that, but those are 3 notes repeated. And usually the bass player will be hit, when you hit a C on the guitar or C on the piano, C major chord, then the bass player will be playing a C note. But what happens if an E is in the bottom note? And let's say instead of like this, instead of C, E, G, it goes E, G, C. How would you note that? Well, simply like this, using a fraction. You may have seen this used before. C with an E in the bass is what that means. The C major chord with an E in the bass. Okay? Or what if the C chord started with a G and you had G, C, E? Well, what you would have then is you would have C with a G in the bass. So whenever you see that written on a chord chart, you know to play a C chord, and then you need to add the G in the bass. And there's no set way, necessarily set way of which G, but it has to be lower than that C because it is in the bass or the lowest note of that chord. And so so this diagram would be what? It would be G with a B in the bass, or G. Another common one would be G with a D in the bass. And those are called alternate bass notes. So if you see that written on a chord chart, if you're a guitar player, you're probably going to want to add that note. And you're definitely going to make sure that your bass player is adding that note. That instead of when you hit a G chord, he's hitting a G note. When you hit a G chord, he's hitting a D note, so that's actually in the bass there. And again, that's called an alternate bass note. Now, for vocalists, all this stuff is very important as well. And here's why. Chord construction is the basis of all harmony. Chord construction is the basis of all harmony. So if the band is hitting a C major chord, here is the 3 notes that I have to choose from. The C, the E, and the G. Now I could do, an octave above the C, or an octave above the E or the G, where somebody is singing the melody being the leading line. In order to do a harmony, I'm going to do one of these chords, one of these notes in this chord. So if somebody's singing a C, I'm going to sing an E, either right beside it or an octave up. Or G, an octave up. Now, and that's what's going to form harmony. So once you're singing a harmony, maybe you've heard people say, well, you sing the fifth, I'll sing the root or the first, or you sing in the third, why don't you sing the fifth, that kind of thing. And that's the basis of all harmony. And whether that's vocal harmony, or harmony is also something that's used on piano. As you're playing harmonies, if you will, and you'll hear interchanges and passing tones that have these chords, and like I hit the diminished chord that resolved into the C, and those are concepts of harmony and melody. But this is the way you build vocal harmony. So if you can figure out, and I think we have a picture of a keyboard with the notes on there. And so even if you don't play, you can figure out how to build harmonies. And especially if you're a vocalist, what you can do is you can hit that C major chord, that C and that E and that G like we have here, and then you can hit that chord and then attempt to sing that C note, and then sing the E note and sing the G note, and hear yourself hitting the first and see what that sounds like, hitting the third, see what that sounds like, hitting the fifth and seeing what that sounds like. Also, as a vocalist, you should be very familiar with this pattern on the keyboard so that you can go through a major scale and you can sing it. And, I would encourage you to, start low, let your voice get warmed up, probably singing the C for a count of 4. We're going to get in that in just a second. And then D for a count of 4, E a count of 4, F, and so forth and so on. Then go back through and maybe do 2 counts on each note, and then back through and maybe 1 count on each note. And then once you get comfortable doing that, hitting the C major chord, and then you singing it without playing it and knowing where those intervals are. And even if you don't consider yourself a vocalist, if you do this enough, then you'll be able to sing. And it's interesting that, in pop, rock, country music, a lot of the people who sing, you wouldn't really term them as really good singers, but there's something unique about their tone that as soon as you hear them sing, that's so-and-so and that's such and such. All right, so we've dealt with this alternate bass thing, we've dealt with this harmony, and again, I'm just trying to give an overview. I'm not going in depth, I'm not doing an analysis of Brahms' lullaby or something Bach wrote or something. This is just a kind of a flyby because I want to keep it in a practical sense, something that you'll use on a daily basis. So we've got pitch pretty much down, the basics of it. Now we're going to deal just real briefly with rhythm. And again, we could take years actually to go over all the different aspects of rhythm and how those things are handled. But for practical daily use, I just want to hit a couple of things real quick. For our purposes, almost every song is written in what we call 4/4 time. And this is also called common time because it is so common. Okay, I would estimate probably 98% of pop, rock, country music, and I'm using those terms as genres of music, not necessarily telling you need to go listen to pop music or country music or rock music, just genres. I mean, you could define worship as country style worship or pop style worship or rock style worship. But 4/4 is the time. Now, why is this important? Because what's going to happen as you play is everything is revolving around this 4 count. Now, we could get really in depth in what this means and how to apply it and all this stuff, but for our purposes, let's just leave it as a loose definition that everything is based on 4. In other words, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so forth and so on. Again, I'm keeping this theory heavy on the practical because if you're a beginning or even intermediate musician, then we want stuff that you can use and not just theory that you're never going to use. So this is going to be very important as we learn to play our instrument because everything is based on this. Now let me show you again on the keyboard how this would affect you. Almost all changes are on this 4/4. And you may have watched some band or something, or you may even see worship here, and notice the drummer goes click, click, or maybe we even say 3, 4, and then we start at 1 again, 3, 4, bringing us into 1. So that 4 count would be, if we put 4 counts, we'll use C, F, G, and we'll put 4 counts on each, And you hear how 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. You hear how everything is based on that 4. There's just a natural ease to the movement. Now, even if it's not so obvious, the 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe we put more notes. But I'm still moving on the 4s. So we're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you hear how the chord changes, 4 counts on each, and let's try it. And if let's say we have 2 counts on each, and hear how that moves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Again, the movements are grouped by 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now this is going to become important when you're trying to practice a song, especially when you're first starting out. Maybe you want to do that 1, 2, 3, 4 and strum the pattern, whether it's on keyboards or a guitar or bass. You want to do that 1, 4. An example of this would be, Lord, I lift your name on high. It's in the key of G. That was in the key of C. I was using C, F, and G, different variations. Key of G, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you practice that strum, and then you begin to speed up, and then you realize that you really need to be spending 2 counts on each chord. So that's a 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So again, everything being based on 4 and counting on the 4. Now I want to cover one more thing before we close, and that's that there's one other counting system that occurs sometimes, enough where we want to mention it, and that's 3/4 time. The top number of this tells you what your counting pattern is. Okay, counting pattern when there's a 4 up there is 1, 2, 3, 4. Counting pattern when there's a 3 up there is 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Now, this is not called common time. It's called 3/4 time. Sometimes it's called waltz time, because all waltzes are in 3/4, or a Tennessee waltz or whatever. All waltzes are in 3/4 time, but just because something's in 3/4 time doesn't mean it's necessarily a waltz, if you follow me there. And 3/4 time, again, it's not nearly as common as 4/4 time. You'll find it in country probably more than in rock and roll and pop, and it has a distinctively different feel that sounds waltzy. Bop, 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 bop. So that's 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but it has that waltzy feel to it. Now, I'll play something, and you tell me if you think that it's in 4/4 or 3/4. That's in 4/4. You hear the 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, let's try another one. 1, 2. So that's in 3/4 time. So you hear it has a total different sound. Again, once you get used to counting, as soon as you hear this, you go, oh, that's common time or that's waltz time. So I just wanted to touch base on that as far as the rhythm that you will actually need to be aware of and that you might use on a daily basis. So if you're playing on a daily basis. So here we've covered some of the